Let's go through all of the books that I read in March, along with my honest reviews of them. The first book that I completed in March was called The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This book is an interesting blend of a fictional story that's based on real stories. I think even some of the characters were based off of real people, while talking about the Underground Railroad through magical realism. So, really interesting book overall. The Water Dancer follows our main character, Hiram, who is an enslaved black man who lives in Virginia. And it really follows him along different parts of his life, and really from when he's very young to about a young adult is when it follows him until. So he was born into slavery, and he lost his mother when he was very young, but he was unofficially adopted by this lady that was seen as this mean old lady of the street that didn't really like kids and didn't really like anything, to be honest, but she liked him, and they felt this sense of shared loss, and so they ended up becoming quite close, and she almost became an adoptive mother to him. So Hiram starts working on the fields when he is still quite young, and he ends up impressing this one master by, I think it was his song that he sang that he really liked, and this master ended up taking him to work at his house. And it turns out that we find this out really early in the book, so no spoilers, but we do find out that this man is actually Hiram's father, who is white. The father, not Hiram. But he ends up taking him to work at his house, and I believe Athena also works there, who is his adoptive mother. So while Hiram works there, he ends up doing some more impressive, almost tricks with his memory and his wit and his intelligence, to the point where this master, his father, tells him that he should start studying under the same mentor who is teaching his half-brother everything, basically. So he does start studying under this mentor or this tutor, and he ends up becoming literate, and he picks up things really, really quickly, and so he ends up surpassing his half-brother quite quickly. So the story continues following their life together, really, until Hiram somehow finds him and his half-brother in a river. And this river basically drowns his half-brother and almost drowns Hiram himself. And he doesn't really know how he gets out of it and how he really survives, or how they really get into the river itself. But he ends up surviving that, and he almost takes the place of his half-brother in terms of an emotional support for his father. He can't really officially take up that position in the house because he is still black. And there's a very interesting link there that comes with him and his father, and how he now exists within that house. After this near-death experience, Hiram basically faces his mortality in a sense, and not just him, but those around him. And there comes a point where this woman that he's in love with, Sophia, says that she can't take it anymore and she has to leave and she has to get out of here. And in that, Hiram decides to hatch a plan to get them to escape, because he can't imagine the thought of staying here without her, or of her having to try to escape by herself and then not really know what happens and if she makes it out to safety. So they hatch their plan, but it gets thwarted and he ends up getting thrown into jail. And then there's a point in time where he has to live this pretty awful, pretty horrendous life in jail. And after he gets released, he finds himself back in slavery, or back in the task as they call it. But this time he doesn't feel quite as resigned to his fate as he did before. He's disillusioned at this point with the idea of slavery, with the idea of staying enslaved, and with the idea of being a good slave. He doesn't really subscribe to that mentality anymore after this experience that he's been through. And he ends up finding himself involved with the Underground Railroad, and he works on freeing himself first, and then he helps the Underground Railroad to free other people and to create safe passage for slaves to escape and to move to different countries, to move to different states, to move to different cities, and to start new lives for themselves, really. And in this process, he learns more about conduction and this experience that he had when he was in the river, where he saw the spirits or the ghosts of his family and his ancestors, and what he thinks is the reason that he survived for. And so he decides to go and learn conduction from this one other person who does it really well in the Underground Railroad, Moses. And so he goes to her, and she's up north, and so he goes north where people are freer, where Black people can have more of a life outside of slavery than they can in the South. And he ends up learning more about conduction from her, and he sees what his life could be up here in the North. But the longer that he stays there, the more that he realizes he doesn't quite want to live there without Sophia and without Athena, really. So he makes the decision to go back to the South and then try to conduct them across to the North. And so he goes back to the South, and he decides to go and free Sophia, Athena, and really just anybody else that he worked with that wanted to be free. And so that's really an overview of the story, and as much of a spoiler-free overview as I can give you. I think one of the things that I liked most about this book was the interesting parallel of the Underground Railroad and conduction. I thought that the magical realism of conduction was really interesting, specifically the idea behind it, and I think the metaphor that it presents, or the imagery that it presents as well. I think I really, really enjoyed that. This whole idea of conduction is very linked to using stories to move people across states, cities, and just large distances that otherwise would take so long to do and would be really, really dangerous, especially when you're thinking about the Underground Railroad. So there's an interesting image that's formed of the Underground Railroad as almost an actual train, but a train that almost starts in one place and then just reappears in another space that's, you know, a whole state away. That's just traveled a really, really long distance. And the idea of this conduction as a train conductor in a train, being the thing that gets them across this Underground Railroad was obviously a very, very interesting play on words and on ideas and on imagery. But the idea that it is stories and community that moves people was really, really well done, in my opinion. The way that conduction really works is that the person who's doing the conducting has to tell the story of which they know the ending of, and they tell this whole story that they remember really well, they have strong emotions attached to, and they know the ending of the story. And in them telling this story, the very power of their words is what creates almost this portal or this wormhole that goes from one place to another. And what I really liked about that was the idea of using community, using shared pain, but also shared joy and shared love, but shared grief and shared loss to make these jumps in space and time, to make these enormous treks that are dangerous, that require a lot of sacrifice from people, and that require quite a bit to be felt and to be gone through in order for these things to actually happen. And I really enjoyed that parallel. I really enjoyed that imagery. I thought that was beautiful. And I know slavery is this very ugly thing, and in no means am I saying that, you know, out of all of this came this really beautiful thing. But I think there's power and there's beauty in understanding how a community lived through something as horrendous as slavery. And I think that those are the stories that should get passed down and should get talked about. And so for that reason, I loved the imagery that the author used here. That this idea of using and telling these stories of ancestors and community that binds us and keeps us together, to tell those stories and to use those stories to save people and to prevent this from happening to more people, I think that was beautiful. I think that was done really well. And so just this link of conduction to the Underground Railroad, I found really well done. I found really well fleshed out. I found really intriguing, and I really did find it very powerful and very beautiful, to be honest. I really enjoyed that part of this book. The other thing that I really liked was the grayness of morality that was brought up in this book. And not just the grayness of morality in people that you think it would be brought up in, but it's also brought up in regards to the different sects of the Underground Railroad, to how, the groups that they had functioning in the North thought very differently from the groups that were functioning in the South, or in just even different parts of the same city, how all of these different factions almost of the railroad had different ideas of what was worth doing and what wasn't, who was worth saving and who wasn't. How do they decide how they allocate their resources and their people? What risks do they take and what risks do they not? And I really appreciated it because even though our main character Hiram wanted to do this work, it didn't always align with what he really believed in. That to him there were times where it felt like his morality was being called into question because he had to make these decisions on behalf of the Underground Railroad. But to him, it felt inhumane to make these decisions on who can we afford to save, or who do we decide is a better bet to save. And I thought that was really interesting because one, I think it's really hard work to do, of course. I don't think that there's ever an easy answer. And not just thinking about slavery, but thinking about a lot of the work, for example, the advocacy work that people have to do today as well. A lot of times you're picking and choosing your battles, and you're picking and choosing what you think is worth fighting for, or where you can expend your resources and where you can afford to spend more time on. We can't all be advocating for every single initiative that we're interested in the same amount, right? And it was the same idea. And I found that really interesting because I think it's really, really easy to just talk about parties that played big roles in absolutely life-changing, world-changing, history-changing things such as slavery, right? It's really easy to look at slavery and just be like, every single person in the Underground Railroad is a hero. But I enjoyed that this book didn't necessarily say that. It didn't necessarily say that every single person felt the exact same or had the same ideas or wanted the same outcomes. And I liked that grayness of the morality. And more than that, I liked that it didn't paint one side as wrong and one side as right, but that there were so many different ways of going about it that really there's no right or wrong. We kind of just all exist and do what we think is the best thing to do. And so I also really enjoyed that part of this book. I also really enjoyed the overall writing style of the book, really. I loved the way that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote. I love, again, the imagery that he painted. I think he really, really does have a way with words, and it really just painted such a beautiful picture. Like I really did feel like I could see everything very clearly in my mind's eye when I was listening to it, because I did listen to this book as an audiobook. I didn't read it. But I don't know. I really, really loved the imagery of this book. I really loved, again, a lot of the parallels that were drawn. I really liked the writing style of it. I felt like it was much more poetic. It felt much more fluid. I don't know. There was something about it that, I don't know if maybe just because water features so heavily in this book, but something about the writing itself felt very fluid and languid, and I really enjoyed that. I don't quite know how to explain it, but there's something quite calming and quite soothing about the way that the book was written. So I did enjoy that. The only thing that I really didn't like about this book was the pacing. I think, as you might have been able to tell as I was giving just my overview or the summary of the book, there was so much to talk about and so much to say that it really felt like a lot of things got lost because of how all-encompassing this book felt. It really, really looks at quite a large span of time in Hiram's life, and not just the timing that it goes through, but the amount of changes that Hiram goes through and experiences is almost overwhelming. There's so much that Ta-Nehisi Coates is getting through that at a point I kind of got lost. I felt like I didn't quite know what storyline we started with and what storyline we're ending with. It felt like it was pulling me in quite a few different directions, but also, I guess, it felt like I was going in a direction that I didn't know we were going to be going in, which felt interesting, especially when he goes up north. I thought that was good, but it kind of threw me off guard because now it felt like there was this whole other story of him living in the north and his experiences up there and how different they were from the life that he lived and really just the person that he was, that it almost felt like another book entirely. Like it didn't feel like it was part of the same book, and I think that threw me off a little bit. I think that was the only thing I didn't like. Outside of that, I felt like the book was good, and I think the story was quite interesting, and I think it was written quite well. I just felt like at a point it felt like a chore to get through the book, which definitely left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. But outside of that, I think I quite enjoyed the book. The second book that I finished in March was called Obstetrix by Naomi Kritzer. This was an ARC, or an advanced reader copy, that I got off of NetGalley, so I was quite excited to read this book. I will note that I read this book in 2 days, which I don't usually go through books that quickly, but this was a short read, but I will say that it did quite grab me, and I did just read it for 2 days and just finish it, so I will note that. The story follows Dr. Liz, who is an OBGYN who ends up performing the last abortion actually in her state. I forget which state it is, I'm not familiar with US geography. I think it was North Dakota or something, I don't know. The only Dakota I know is from The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, so there you go. So anyways, she performed the last abortion in that state, and it was the last because she ended up going on trial and there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened. So just nobody performed abortions anymore because they wanted to avoid what she had gone through. But because of all of the press that she got for that, she really had a hard time finding a job and just finding a new place to work as an OBGYN. When she gets this offer for an interview that feels a little bit sketchy, she ends up taking it because obviously she's desperate for a job. And at the interview, she ends up getting drugged and kidnapped, and she gets taken to this compound where this cult lives, basically. So actually, it's kind of similar to The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, which maybe is why it was set in Dakota. So there you go. So she is basically forced to stay in this compound with this cult and act as their doctor and their OBGYN, especially for their pregnant women. And this cult is, as any cult, pretty cut off from the rest of the world. They have very, very little access to just things like Wi-Fi, phone services, all that kind of stuff that connects you to the outside world. And so she has to lay low and plan to escape and then take her opportunity to escape. But the story really follows her experience as the doctor, getting to know these women and these girls better who are part of the cult and trying to escape from this cult. I really do think that the main character, Liz, is the reason that I liked the book as much as I did. She is quite a different character in the sense that she was very level-headed, she was very sensible, and she didn't try to make any moves too early in the book, which I think I really appreciated and doesn't happen quite as often as you would hope that it would happen. So in that sense, she felt very realistic. She felt very relatable. She also didn't really feel like it was her duty to help this cult, really. And she didn't feel like she had to do things because, oh, she was a doctor and this was her calling, which I understand, but in books it can come off quite shallow in a sense, for lack of a better word. It just feels like this person has no other character traits except being a doctor, which is kind of weird. But there's this sense of, oh, all doctors are just such nice, empathetic, kind-hearted, selfless people, which for the most part isn't, it's not really that true. Like, your profession doesn't always say a lot about who you are necessarily. And so I really liked that in this book, she wasn't depicted as this large hearted person who just couldn't imagine these people just suffering, and she just felt like she had to stick to her Hippocratic oath and whatever. She was quite pragmatic about it, she sat there and she was like, I'm not going to do anything unless there's something really, really horrendous going on and someone could literally die. And even in that sense, it wasn't, she wasn't like, oh, I don't want someone to lose their life. She was like, I don't want to have to live with the fact that someone literally bled out in front of me. Like, it's very, I don't know, she was very realistic in that sense, right? It was very much a sense of, I just want to be able to deal with this and get through this and then escape. Like, I'm just trying to survive. And I quite like that. I like that it didn't hinge on just her being a doctor and being kind and sweet. So I like that. She also didn't become this, anti-cult leader in the midst of this cult. Again, she laid pretty low. She did what they asked her to do to the best of her ability. She didn't give any more. She didn't give any less. She had to get involved because that was what they asked of her. And through that, she unexpectedly started to gain trust of the women and the girls that she was talking to and living with. And through her gaining that trust, she started to see the cracks in so many different people's facades, really. She started to see how people really felt. All of the stuff that they were keeping inside that they didn't quite say because they weren't sure if anybody else felt the same way that they did. But when she came in and someone who didn't buy into the cult and someone who hasn't lived in this compound for a while now, it felt like their connection to the outside world had been restored in a sense, right? And so they could be more free around her and they could talk about these things that they missed about the outside world. And so in that way, she began to develop relationships with people and she started to realize that maybe she isn't the only one who doesn't want to be here. And I liked that because, again, it was very gradual, it was very subtle, and it didn't hinge on her being this unlikely hero. And most importantly, it didn't paint everyone else in the compound as these helpless women who couldn't leave and didn't have the strength or the bravery to get out of the compound themselves. So I really quite enjoyed that. And I won't give away anything else because I do want these to be spoiler free again. So I think it's even further punctuated in the way that the story ends, which I really appreciate. Like I said earlier, the book was quite short and it's quite punchy in a way. I don't know, you kind of get from start to finish and it's very clear on what the plot line is, on where you're going with things. And, you start the book and it's like, all right, the end result is her either escaping this cult or having to stay here forever, right? Like, there were only two options. So I did enjoy that the plot seemed relatively straightforward, and I did enjoy really the overall pacing of the book as well. I felt that it was done quite well. There weren't really moments where it dragged because it felt like every scene had a purpose. Every time that she was interacting with someone, she learned something a little bit more about them, and that added to her character or their own character. And I really appreciated that because it felt like it kept the story moving. And like I said, I did finish this book in 2 days, so it really surprisingly pulled me in. And I will say I didn't quite expect it to pull me in because initially when I started reading this book, it felt quite choppy and abrupt, the writing that is. The sentences felt a little shorter than you would expect them to. It felt it felt more like a narration than a story, which I thought felt a little awkward at the start. And I was like, oh, I don't really know if I'm going to be able to get into this book. But it just sucked me in once things started happening. And I don't know, I'm not really the type of person to entirely lose myself in a book. I I really love reading and I do enjoy reading, but I have so many thoughts in my head at any given point in time that it's really hard for me to truly get lost in a book because I'm just always, my brain is always moving in so many different directions. But this book really pulled me. Like I didn't even realize how quickly I was getting through the book because of how it pulled me in. And again, not in a sense of, there was so much that was happening and it was action packed and it was, I don't know, there wasn't anything particularly brilliant about it, but there was something in the simplicity of the way that the book was written that pulled me in. Like I was getting through it quite quickly, but I was enjoying it and I was getting through it quickly because I wanted to know what was happening next. And again, not in a sense of I was on the edge of my seat and I needed to know what was happening. It was just more of, oh, I wonder what she finds out the next time that she talks to this person. Or, oh, I wonder what her next move is now that she knows this piece of information. Or, oh, I wonder what's going to happen to this person's pregnancy. I'm interested in knowing what happens to that child. And it's very interesting. I really can't explain it because, again, it's not like this book had something really brilliant and really unique that you can stand and praise for hours on end, but I really enjoyed the simplicity of a good story just being told and being quite straightforward. I really enjoyed it. Another really interesting aspect of this book was the underlying uneasiness or eeriness or horror of the book. I think that there was this underlying sense of worry and of fear for what would happen to the women and the children in this cult. And I think that that was developed quite well because, again, it was very subtle. It was very, it just simmered beneath the surface, right? There was this sense of, here are these children that are being forced into living in this cult and they don't really want to be there. And there is this sense of, there are these women that are having to face a lot of hardships, being in a cult where men are the ones who are in charge and have the final say. And those power imbalances and these unfortunate circumstances always tend to favor the men and really put women in very dangerous situations and in situations that can go south very quickly. So I think I really appreciated that subtle fear that came through in the writing. Just a sense of urgency of wanting these girls and these women to escape and to be free and for this cult to just not be a thing anymore, because you want them to be safe and you want them to have a future that they actually want and that they are interested in. So I did quite like that, and I'm not going to say I enjoyed it because but I enjoyed the way that that was written into the book. I think that that was done quite well. And like I said before, the only thing that I really thought that I could point at and say I didn't quite like was the writing initially, because like I said, it does feel a little stinted almost when you're reading it. It can feel very choppy and you're kind of like, oh, that just feels a little brash or a little like abrupt when you're reading it. But I don't know, you get used to it. Like you stop noticing it after a while, but also it fits the story. I think it fits the theme and it fits the vibe of the story as well, and the way that the book is written. At the end of the day, it kind of lends to the pacing of the book itself. I think it lends to the length of the book and to the character herself, really. At the end of the day, I think it's almost a reflection of how she is processing this entire experience and this entire story. So really, I think it evens out and I think you get used to it, and then you're not really as aware of how abrupt the writing can feel when you first started. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. So I believe that this book comes out on June 9th of this year, of 2026. So I would highly recommend checking this book out once it does release, if this sounds like something you're interested in. The third book that I finished this month was called The Felicity Complex by August Clark. This was also an ARC, or an advanced reader copy. You will see in the marketing that it's said to be a mix between Annie Bot and Fallout. Now, I haven't read Annie Bot, but I do love Fallout. I love the games and I love the show. So that was the main reason I was drawn to this. And I will say that I think it's quite accurate in that if you enjoyed Fallout, I think you really will enjoy this book, especially if you were pulled into more of the almost the side adventures, the wit of the show, the almost unseriousness of it, and the game. I think they share a lot of similarities. I think if you were really interested in that, I think this is a book that you would most likely enjoy. The start of the book is set in the Cold War, and so fearing atomic fallout, really, and just atomic annihilation, during the period of the Cold War, the US has been working on just trying to get a leg up in the technology race against Russia. And almost a byproduct of all of the work that they've been doing ends up being these women's specimen that they create that can withstand nuclear annihilation, basically, and can withstand the end of the world, really. These women specimens end up becoming part of a project where they build luxury underground bunkers for the elite to survive the war and to wait out the just wasteland, basically, and be able to go back up and continue living after the entire Earth's population has been eradicated by atomic bombs. So they are sent down in the bunker, and it turns out that there's a whole long time where they don't receive the visitors that they thought they were going to receive, and then at some point they do have those visitors stumble in, but it seems like there's a lot more time that's passed than they anticipated. And in that time, the girls themselves and the bunker itself has changed quite a bit. And pretty soon after these visitors or these guests join them in the bunker, things go pretty haywire when the girls or the specimen realize that they just cannot live out the rest of their life in this bunker and decide to try to get to the surface. I think there were so many things that I enjoyed in this book that I don't quite know what I would say is the thing that I enjoyed the most. The plot line was really, really great. It was almost, I don't know, I guess it felt, I don't even know how to explain it. Maybe this is the closest way to explain it. It felt a bit like a D&D campaign in a sense. It was witty, it was a bit ludicrous, it was kind of wild and a little bit all over the place, but I think it really worked for this book and for this story. I think just the general storyline really did pull you in because of how bonkers it felt. I think the writing style really, really lended to that feeling of, I don't want to say insanity, but it felt a little bit like that. It felt a little bit like everything was so chaotic, but in a very eerie sense. It was like everything was so chaotic because people weren't really quite thinking things through, because they weren't given the time to think through it because they were being brainwashed, you know? So it was quite interesting in that sense. And it also felt that way because our narrator almost felt that way. So the specimen that we have as our narrator is a bit of an airheaded, a bit of a immature, too trusting person. And so she ends up, you know, with her voice being the narrator of the story, it ends up feeling even more bonkers and even more not quite there, because that's just her personality. Is, you know, she tends to trust people, she tends to see the best in people, she tends to assume that people have the best intentions, and people are just kind and they just want the best from everyone else. She has the sense of it is her responsibility and her duty to be the best host of this luxury underground bunker that she can be. And she thinks that if she's really, really good at that, people will like her and people will give her what she wants, and that people will love her. Really, that's how she thinks and how she feels. And so it's really, really interesting to see her in comparison to a lot of the other characters, because the other characters in the other specimen seem to have more of their wits about them, and they seem to understand more about what's actually happening. They seem to be able to read people's true intentions. They seem to understand the real reasons behind why some things are done and why things are set up the way that they are, in a way that our main character doesn't quite get, and seems to just, like, these things just seem to go right over her head, you know? And as I've been talking about the characters, I will say that really the characters were also a big reason I really enjoyed this book. Not just our narrator, but all of the other specimen that she's with and she lives with are so interesting and so unique and so different from a lot of other characters that you would read in a lot of other books. Each of the characters were designed to represent a certain archetype of womanhood that the US was trying to preserve through the Cold War and through, you know, the dirty communist influence. So the whole goal is that, you know, these women are going to remain untouched by time and untouched by the corruption that comes with change and with communism, and they wanted this to be almost the true, like the last true vestiges of the American dream. And that's kind of the whole goal and the whole atmosphere of this book and this story. And so these women, very interestingly, are meant to represent different parts of what you would consider, or what people would consider, the ideal woman, and how they would really just react in situations and how they would serve people around them, in a sense. And it's quite interesting to see how our main character, Hallelujah, our narrator, she's very, you know, she leans into her archetype very much, and she fully believes that this archetype is who she should be and who she should embody. But a lot of these other specimen are quite clear on the fact that these archetypes are oppressive, that they can be demeaning, that it's really not for their sake or for their safety, it's to serve other people and to give other people what they think they want from women. And they understand how that demeans them. Like, they understand how that affects them. And I thought that was really interesting. And it's super interesting to see the evolution of them also trying to believe in their archetype, seeing through it quickly, and then trying to almost protect the others who still feel like they're innocent and they're childlike, but also trying to shake sense into them in a way and be like, this isn't for our good, this is for everybody else's good, and we're going to be treated awfully once we're in that bunker, or really just right now. So I thought that was quite interesting, and I really liked seeing the different experiences and the different journeys that each of these characters went on to become who they were at the end of the story. So I really enjoyed that. The other thing that I really enjoyed about this book was everything felt very subtle and very layered. There are a lot of things that are left unspoken in this book. There's a lot that's left to the imagination, there's a lot that's left to guesswork, to hinting, to those types of subtleties that really make you need to sit with the book after you've read it and really think about all of these things that were implied as you read the book, because there's a lot that happens off the page and like off screen that you don't really see and that no one ever really confirms. Like, you just have these things, and it's almost like, depending on your experience and your view of the world, you might think that those things are different. and what you could imagine being the worst case scenario of this thing that's left off the page is really almost a reflection of what you see in the world and of what you think of people and what people have done to make you believe that. So I thought that that was really interesting, and I think I really appreciated that, because it almost felt like the real horror was in guessing what the horror might have been. You know, like there was no way to confirm that this is what happened and that this is truly the extent of what this person had to endure or had to experience. It's kind of just left up to you to decide almost what they went through or what their fate was. And I found that quite interesting. Again, quite unique. And I don't really think that there are as many books as there should be that do that, because I think it really makes it even more unsettling, right? To one, not have that closure, but two, not really knowing what happens means that you don't quite know how it affects a person, which again, I thought was quite interesting and quite a good reflection of really our reality and people that we engage with and that we talk to. So again, I really like that. And I think that was something that really pulled me in when I was reading this book. When it comes to this book, I don't really think there's something that I could point to and I could say, I didn't like this or I didn't enjoy this. Like I said, a lot of things felt unwritten, and they felt unspoken. And because of that, it's one of those books that I really have to sit with, and almost I will reread this book, because I just feel like there's so much content that is both written and unwritten in this book that you really need to sit with it after and just like mull over your thoughts, but also reread it, knowing what happens and knowing what comes of these characters, to be able to go back and read it and almost see their evolution or their descent into whatever they become at the end of the book. So I really enjoyed this book. I believe this book releases on 15th July of 2026. So again, if anything in this review felt like it would pull you in or felt like something that you'd be interested in, I would highly recommend that you get a copy of this book when it comes out. Like I said, I really enjoyed this book, and this is absolutely the sort of book that I would go out of my way and actually purchase, even in today's book pricing world. So do with that what you will. The last book that I completed in March was called You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People by Aubrey Gordon. I did listen to this book as an audiobook, and it is a non-fiction book, so I definitely tend to do better on audiobooks. Because it is a non-fiction, it's not like there's really a story or an overview that I can give you, or much else about why I liked something as opposed to what I got from the book. So this one will be a bit of a different review from the other books. I found this book because I love Aubrey Gordon and her podcast, Maintenance Phase. And so I was listening to the episodes, and I tend to listen to oldest to newest when it comes to podcasts that I find. And so I'm very slowly making my way through the podcast, and I finally got to the episode where she was talking about her releasing her book, her second book, and how she was narrating it herself. And I was like, say less, Aubrey, I'm gonna get that book. So luckily my library had it and it was just available, and I listened to it, and I really did think it was a very interesting book. Mostly because it was the first book that I read when it comes to specifically anti-fat bias. So I don't know that this would necessarily be the best book on anti-fat bias, and I don't think it is by any means, but I felt like it was a really good introduction into this whole new topic that I think I had never really thought about that in depth before. So for me, I really appreciated this book in that it was a great gateway into this world and this topic, especially into a topic that, again, I hadn't really thought that much about, and I didn't realize quite how pervasive it was. So I really enjoyed the book for that aspect. I will say one of the things that I really did appreciate about this book was that she gave you some really good resources on where to go now that you've started learning more about anti-fat bias and you really started to deconstruct your own bias. I really appreciated that she gave a lot of these resources, specifically that she gave a lot of resources that linked to experiences of intersectional identities. She talked a lot about Black literature, specifically on anti-fat bias, because there's a lot of linkage between anti-fat bias and racism. And I thought that that was really interesting. And again, I really appreciated that she gave me almost just like this list of references and a list of these really great books that I could now go and listen to as I'm learning more and as I'm going on this journey of deconstructing my bias. And I thought that that was really interesting, and I thought that that was really well done. I also really appreciated that the whole time Aubrey Gordon was able to maintain a very intersectional lens when it came to talking about anti-fat biases and experiences of fat people. I really, really appreciated that she was quite clear on the fact that, you know, she was a white woman and her experience could be very, very different from a Black woman, from a brown woman, from a Black trans person, that there are so many different experiences that you have depending on the other identities that you hold while being fat. And I really appreciated that she stressed that a lot. And again, that she stressed that with the idea of, if you're deconstructing your biases when it comes to anti-fat biases, you can't do that just for straight white men who are fat. You need to be able to extend the same type of empathy and the same type of deconstruction to racialized fat people, to disabled fat people, to homeless fat people. You need to be able to extend this deconstruction of your bias to all of these different groups. That being fat isn't just one universal experience. And I really, really appreciated that she stressed that over and over and over in the book. And I know that that can sound like it was repetitive, and maybe it was repetitive to some people, but I think it's really important to keep mentioning that because it's really easy for people to forget that. And it's really easy for people to deconstruct one type of bias just to then lean on another type of bias to continue your discomfort or your hatred for certain groups. Because it's really easy to say, you know, oh yeah, well, I can deconstruct my anti-fat bias for someone who's disabled because there are all of these things that I can create in my head. But like, if someone's homeless, I don't get why they should be fat. Anyways, that's an awful example. But the point is that when it comes to understanding experiences of marginalized communities, you cannot do that from only one viewpoint. So I really enjoyed that. So I really appreciated that. I'm not going to say I enjoyed it. I appreciated it. So yeah, I don't know. I think this just was a great book when it comes to thinking about, and again, deconstructing, dissecting, and really understanding where and how anti-fat biases come into play. And so I think this book was a great introduction for that. I'm really excited to read more books on this topic and to learn more. So I've already put a few books on hold in my library, but I'm really excited to learn more. And I shouldn't say excited. I'm so excited to learn how biased I am. No, I'm interested, I'm intrigued, and I'm excited to learn more. I'm excited to learn more about something that I never thought that deeply about, and I didn't realize how pervasive it was, because I feel like there are a lot of other experiences that I felt more attuned to, and specifically growing up brown. Everyone was called fat, and so it's really hard to also distinguish between an experience as a fat person and an experience as someone who was called fat. So I thought, you know, anyways, I think there's just like a lot there that I hadn't really thought about in my own life and just in everything that I've seen around me as well. So I think that this is a topic that I've never thought that deeply about. So I'm eager to learn more. Let's say that I'm eager. I'm not excited. I'm eager to learn more. So yeah. So if you are someone who is interested in learning more about this topic, if you're someone who's maybe enjoyed maintenance phase and you're looking for a book to read or to listen to, I would highly recommend this book. And I would highly recommend taking the suggestions that she's given in the book so you can find other resources as you're learning more about it to make sure that you're taking a more holistic and a more intersectional approach to dissecting your biases. Those were all of the books that I completed in March, so I think I had a pretty good month. I was a little bit slower on my book completion this month, but I enjoyed the books that I read this month. I felt like I had quite a good mix of different types of books. I had a good mix of lengths of books and topics, which I really enjoyed. And I think overall, it was a successful reading month. So I was happy with the books I read. I wasn't awfully disappointed by any of them, which is a miracle. So I was really happy. I'm pretty content with that month of reading, and I will be updating my reading journal soon, so you should look out for a video on that. And I'm excited to continue reading in this month. So I will see you same time next month for my wrap up on what I read for April. Let me know if you read any of the books that I finished in March. And if you did, tell me if you agree with what I said, or if you have different thoughts on the books, or what you felt like you took away from them. I love hearing from you guys. Anyways, I will see you next time.